Wish you were one of those influencers with raving fans who binge on your every word, consume all your content, buy everything you have to sell, and demand even more? Then stay tuned while Authority Magazine columnist and BuzzFeed contributor Tracy Hazzard shares strategies, tips, and tactics from top videocasters, podcasters, authors, and social influencers on creating that bingeable factor. Now, let's join Tracy as she explores how to rise above all the digital noise with the Binge Factor.
Welcome back to the Binge Factor. I'm Tracy Hazzard, and I am interviewing someone a little bit different today because it's a really tightly niched podcast, but it's also a part of a bigger network. So I thought it would be a really interesting model for you all to look at as success in podcasting is at all different levels. So I've got Jeremy Evans from Bleav in Sports Law. Now, BLEAV, Bleav, not Bleav, is the way that you say that. And that's the network's name. And that has to do with those that are in law and entertainment, athletes, and it has to do with the whole ecosystem around those that participate in this sort of sports and entertainment industry. So their whole network has many, many shows on them, and Sports Law is one of them, Jeremy's show. He started the show about a year ago, and he's the founder and managing attorney at California Sports Lawyer, who represents entertainment, media, and sports clientele. And he is an award-winning attorney and industry leader based in Los Angeles. Now, Jeremy and I met because we're both a part of a similar group, a group that is looking at advising and helping those in the sports and entertainment industry. I'm obviously doing that on podcasts, and he's doing that on entertainment law. And various things happen in those groups where we exchange ideas and all kinds of things together. And that's how we met. His clients range from Fortune 500 companies to athletes, entertainers, models, television and film producers, studios, entertainment, media, and sports businesses in contractual intellectual property, formation, distribution, negotiation, and deal-making matters. This is the deep niche that is Jeremy's podcast. He's a graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and an emphasis in American politics. Thomas Jefferson School of Law with a Juris Doctor, Pepperdine University School of Law, and a Master of Laws in Entertainment, Media, and Sports Law. He has, prior to opening up California Sports Lawyer, Jeremy worked as a graduate law clerk at the Superior Court of California, advising judicial officers in civil and criminal law and motion matters. Jeremy is a really interesting podcast, a really interesting guy in how he approaches it and how he's utilizing it for his business. And it doesn't generate a lot of leads. You'll hear him say that, but it is a credibility factor for him. It is helping to build that. And because it's so deeply in the niche, I Bleav that that's the binge factor value for him with the right clientele, because they're attracted to the two things. They're attracted to that community that surround the network, and hopefully that the network is, bringing you listeners, right? Like that's the goal of any network. We'll talk about that on the end of this podcast. But, looking at from that perspective, that deep dive niche, and then surrounding yourself with other podcasts that are around topics that are around that of core interest to that audience and community is a success builder and a success factor in and of itself. So let's talk to Jeremy Evans, Bleav in Sports Law. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm excited to talk sports law. You're going to think it's like an in the weeds topic, but it's really not. What you talk about is so universal across almost every single sport I can think of.
Yeah, it's a multi-billion dollar industry. And it's interesting because before I got into sports, I didn't really think about getting into it. It was more like, I want to be a district attorney, or I want to do this based on whatever shows I was watching, Law and Order or whatever, right? And once I finally got into it, I did a baseball arbitration competition in law school. And that sounds really nerdy, and it is. And I did that, but it really opened up these opportunities to me where I was like, wait, I can do what I love and make money at it. And so maybe that's obvious to a lot of people, but to me at the time, it was like, okay, I'm going to pursue this. And once I got in, like you said, you realize that it affects everybody. And I think as I've gotten older, I've realized that it's not just the law part, it's the business aspect, and it's the marketing, and it's the advertising, and it's all those things that actually really get me up in the morning. That's the stuff that excites me. The law stuff, that's okay, but
it's a means to an end, right?
Right, exactly.
I love that. So, is that kind of how podcasting came about? As you've been thinking and analyzing this sort of marketing and outreach and things, is that how podcasting came into your purview of like, what am I going to do?
Really good question. And I would say that I actually applied on LinkedIn for a job at the Bleav podcast network. And it was to be their in-house counsel. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a great opportunity, right? Well, I ended up getting on the phone with the CEO of the company, great guy. And he goes, Jeremy, we think that you're a great attorney, but we actually think you'd be even a better host of a show. So
that's so funny. They're like, I'm sorry, but we would just like you to be a host.
Right.
So it had never occurred to you to do that before?
Well, I had thought about doing podcasting, and I've done a weekly column for years now, and I've got, over 300 something articles. So that was out there, and I appeared at events, put on events. So I clearly knew the marketing value, but I think for me, I wanted to have a distribution platform. And it's like the quote by Jonathan Perelman, content is king, distribution is queen, and she wears the pants. And so for me, it was like, I didn't want to just do some random podcast. I wanted to have a platform and a tool to do it. And so when Bleav came along and said, they basically set it up for me and there was no cost to me. And it was a really easy thing. I was like, okay, this is perfect. This is what I needed.
So that's the power of joining a network, and not everyone's so lucky to get to join a network. But what advice did they give you when you were getting started about, in terms of like prepping you to be a host because you'd never done it before?
Yeah, I'd appeared on television before, major news networks, and I, obviously was okay with speaking, but you are right, having to record by yourself, and even if there's video like we're doing here, it's something you definitely have to become comfortable with. The best things that they told me were like, the average commute time is about 20 minutes. And so, you generally want your shows to be 20 minutes long. So I was like, okay, I can go 15 to 20 minutes, I've also realized that when I looked around at most media, there is shows like the Joe Rogan show, whatever, that has like, 3 hours long. But most people don't have time to sit there and do that. And so I was like, okay, what can I get out there that is straightforward and direct and people can listen to and really get used to? And 3 hours was just too much. I didn't have that amount of time, and I didn't think people would listen to for that long. So,
that's an old school podcast misconception that the show, that the average commute time, because, well, we know today there is no commute, right? Like most of us aren't commuting at all. So that's, that doesn't apply anymore. And so I think you've figured that out just in the way that you started creating content as to what people are responding to. Because we found out really early with our very first show, when we followed that guideline 6 years ago and did that rule, that what happened was people were like, I would like more. I would like you to go longer. And I was like, you want us to do more? Okay, we're in it. But we didn't expect our audience to do that. And then recently I interviewed someone from the Buffer podcast, and because that's social media, their listeners said, we want less. We want sound bites. We want 5-minute episodes because they have no attention span. So you really have to listen to your listeners. And for you, we're going to dive into your bingeability factor, but for your genre, you're educating. And so when you do an educational, that sometimes more is important. And so you always have to look at that size to be right for, am I teaching enough here, but not overwhelming? So, and is it the right amount of time for that? So good thing that you've sort of developed that over time. You do different formats though, or you did earlier and you've sort of switched. Is that quarantine thing, or was that purposeful? Because you used to do some interview chats at the beginning of the show, and now you don't have as many in the most recent part of your feed.
The recent ones, no. I think the last one I did an interview was about a month ago. It's just more about availability of people and what they're comfortable doing.
So it wasn't that you found it didn't work. You were just, it just hasn't.
To be honest with you, I would love to do an interview for every show. It's just getting the right people. And I will say that I recently provided a list of about 70 different contacts, CEOs of different companies that I've connected with, major talent and business leaders that I'm hoping to get on the show. And so I provided that to Bleav, basically saying, reach out to these folks and see if we can get them on the show. So the hope is there's going to be a lot more of that.
Well, yeah. And, another process is to work with a couple of, because in your industry, in the sports industry, there are publicity firms that specialize in that area. And I'm actually going to refer a couple to you that I know in LA. So they can send you their clients, which makes it easier for you because they're constantly feeding you the right profile people.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So that's a way. There you go. You can grow your show there and get those accomplished. But yeah, it has been challenging right now, right? It's challenging to get the interviews scheduled. Not everybody's working, especially in sports and entertainment where you are, where you play here. There, everyone's up in the air. It's like, what am I doing right now? So they're hesitant to maybe even do interviews right at this moment.
Right. Agreed.
Yeah. So, well, how have you enjoyed it? Like, what have you found to be the best part about podcasting, and maybe some of the thing you thought you would love and you just don't?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what I try to do every week is I'll set out like a list I'll think about topics that have happened during the week, and I'll get ideas from reading the trades, Hollywood Reporter, Variety, Billboard, front office sports, and I keep up in the industry and what's going on. And from that, I'll develop ideas and I'll go, okay, well, this is interesting. What are the trends here? And I'll try to look at it from a legal and a deal-making standpoint. And I'll usually write a weekly column. And sometimes even the podcast will be about the weekly column. So if people don't want to read it, they can hear about it on the podcast. And I'll expand more when I talk than I would if I was writing something. And I think it's interesting because I will say that it's so funny, like when you set up an interview, like you go into it thinking, oh man, this is going to be a fantastic interview, right? And this is going to be great content. And what I've found is that unfortunately, whether it be people not being comfortable with interviews or even more than that, it's that they can't divulge certain information. And so I'll have a major person on the podcast and it's like, I won't even be asking controversial questions, but sometimes I feel like I get like corporate responses and I'm like, hey, we should have a little bit more fun here. This is not supposed to be like a gotcha thing. I'm not a journalist. But that's probably one of the biggest frustrations and surprises, honestly.
Well, this is the thing. The funny part is that you think that people understand podcasts, but maybe they don't. And they haven't really listened to many. And so they don't understand that sort of distinction between what they're trained to do on TV and the sound bites for radio when you do a really small spot, and they haven't gotten into this, this is more casual, this is more intimate. And so it's more of I think, an industry education with whoever their publicist is and whoever their media people are, getting them used to the fact that this is a different media type.
Sure.
And they need to be trained differently. So so we're all kind of breaking them in the process for those of us doing the interviews, right?
100%.
But yeah, I agree with you. If it doesn't come out right, it doesn't come out right. Now, have you not aired something because you were unhappy with it, that you thought it was just not good enough?
No, thankfully I've not had that situation. I will say from a technology standpoint, it's been frustrating on one or probably two occasions where we've recorded. And unfortunately, with people being at home, it may take 30 minutes to get set up on a simple, because I'll usually use like Zencaster or something else, right?
Yeah.
It'll take 30 minutes all you have to do is click the link. Just go to the link, make sure your computer has a microphone and your volume is on.
That's why we keep it simple here and we only use Zoom now, because it does happen. It happens when you use these other systems that you get people who only have a phone. They don't even have a computer that they're being your guest from. And especially when as you are in a place at which you're broadening out who you're reaching to, and they're traveling and they're busy and it's hard to get them. So having the easiest technology, the easiest way for them to connect up with you is going to be better in the long run. But I can see that being frustrating because you only have so much time with someone. So that'll cut your interview really short.
There was one time where I had to send in 52 edits to the recording just to bleep out background noises, children in the background, dogs in the background. So the episode sounds great, but ultimately it took a while to get there.
Oh, no. So do you listen afterwards? So let's talk a little production things. So do you listen afterwards and make your edit notes, or do you write it down while you're recording?
So I'll write it down while I'm recording, but thankfully I've been pretty good in the sense that I'm used to public speaking and I'm okay speaking by myself. That's probably the easiest thing.
So those parts go smoothly.
Right. Those parts go smoothly. Where I have to edit is if there's like an odd exchange with a guest or like in terms of like a transfer, like I'll ask a question and there'll be like 10 seconds of pause or, so that sort of stuff. But thankfully I've been good at sort of like recording once and then it's good to go.
Yeah. I love that. That's my preferred way, is just to go with it, right? Saves time for everyone. Well, let's talk about our 5 things that we do to try to create really successful shows, and then we'll get into your bingeability factor. So
Cool.
What are some of the best ways you found to increase listeners?
That's a really good point. It's usually by bringing in other people. So if I have a special guest on, they're more likely to share the information or share the podcast. I recently had on the chief development officer for the Rose Bowl, and then another gentleman who runs a major global sports sponsorship program for a big company. And it was interesting because they shared it with some of their students in their class and shared it on social media. And of course, the numbers went way up.
Well, that's how you also hit some binge numbers. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Right.
I love that. So getting other people to share it is a great way to increase listeners. So what are some of the ways, though, that you are able to encourage engagement with those listeners?
That's something I'm learning every day. Social media is such an interesting place. So I'll use all platforms to share it. Bleav does a really good job of posting it every week on their Instagram account. So I'm learning there. I think engagement probably could be more. I think maybe the better guest I get on, maybe that'll increase. Maybe the more people realize that the content I'm putting out is helpful. Because I know I get a ton of views on the articles that I write, but getting those people to transfer over to the podcast, I'm learning. I frankly don't know what the answer is.
This is the in-process part, right?
Right. And it's tough too on social media because engagement's great, but especially in a time like now, it's so like you almost feel like you put out an opinion out there and you got 50,000 people with a different view. And that part is tough. That part's hard to, So.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we talked a little bit about how you're going about getting guests, but do you have some kind of criteria on how you ensure that they're a right fit for you?
Good question. Number one is like I have to know them. I feel like, because I'll get invites for people to speak on the show. And unless they're like top talent and I know that they can deliver, I'm not going to do it. Because I'll get people that'll say, hey, I want to promote my book or I want to do this. And I'm just like, that's just not what the show's for. I want to be true to the listeners that are out there. And I don't want them to be listening to some book review on a book I've never even read. So it's a really good question, but I have to be close to them. I have to know them, be connected to them. I've had to have talked to them once before, and they have to be in the industry, and I try to steer away from attorneys in the sense that I bring attorneys on, but I don't want it to be strictly like, this is just lawyers on the show.
A whole bunch of law and that's it.
Exactly. So those are usually my criteria. I know them and they have some connection to the industry.
And if you don't know them, but they intrigue you, do you have a pre-call or do anything like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll have a phone call and kind of feel them out. Or if I know somebody that knows them, I'll, inquire with.
Can these people speak eloquently?
Like there was one time I got invited to do a radio show and we did a pre-phone call. And this wasn't even my show. This was a radio show I was being invited to. And the pre-call was nothing but F-bombs on the entire show. And I was just like, look, there's no way that I'm getting on this show. And there were some controversial things that were said. I was just like, don't invite me. Like, I'm good.
Oh my gosh, how funny. Well, that's, those are some things that I think a lot of people have to pay attention to, that getting great guests isn't just like, oh, it's a big name. It's let's check all this stuff out and make sure that it's going to be right. You're the curator for your audience, for your listeners. And if you don't curate well, then they're not going to keep listening. So smart moves there. Producing in a professional way. You're working with, obviously with a network. So you've got production help on the other side, but what do you do on your end to make sure that this is the most professional production you can put together?
Really good question. And that was something they helped out with a lot because they would recommend a certain microphone or certain platforms to use. I found that recording from my laptop is completely fine. Just make sure that it turned the air conditioner off and that the fridge isn't like going crazy. Or I thankfully have not had, I obviously live in an apartment and usually where I record, the door's right behind me. And so thankfully I've not had like dogs running down the hallway or anything like that. But you try to improvise and you hopefully can take a pause and then cut it out later on. But that's pretty much what I've been able to do. And
so do you write an outline or a script when you're planning your solo topics?
I do, yeah. So I'll usually write the weekly column and then I will, unless there's like some huge hot topic going on and I've already written the article, I will definitely write an outline. I will have like 3 or 4 major points I want to touch on. And those end up being the best shows because I can just look at an article or look at the topics I'm going through and it works out fine.
Wonderful. Well, hey, it wouldn't be podcasting if we didn't talk about monetization. So our last thing is like you've thought in monetization because you're already working with a network. There are ads in place. But did you really think about what it would do in terms of alternative monetization? Like has it been working for your business? What is it doing for you? And how is it monetizing what you do every day?
That's such a great question, Tracy. Maybe the most important question in the sense that the money has not been like, I don't have 1 million followers or 100,000 listeners, right? And so in that sense, the money's just not going to be there from an advertising standpoint. It's there, but it's not going to be huge numbers. But I agree with you 100%. The monetization is really in the fact that when people look me up on my website or whatever, they go, oh, he has a podcast. And frankly, it allows me to be an expert in a subject because I have to do the research before I can actually comment on it. So I've loved it in that sense. And it's really cool to have because it's like, regardless if I had 1 listener, I would still be proud of it because I would go, I put time and effort into this and it's nice to have your own show and to be able to be like, hey, I'm a producer. So at least in that sense, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is really great. And I think that you're right. The authority building aspect of it is probably serving you very, very well. Well, let's talk a little bit about bingeability factors. So everyone who listens to the show knows that I'm obviously the show's called the Binge Factor for a reason. And that's because we believe that when people binge and consume more, they want more. They want to buy. They want more of you. They already begin to know, like, and trust you faster, right? So those trust factors, and I imagine trust building is an extremely important part in your business because the sports side of it is ripe with lots of scam artists and lots of people who take advantage of others. And the sports figures that I've worked with many of them go through 5, 6 marketing firms in the 2 years they're working with me or things like that. So they are very used to being sold a bill of goods that doesn't fly, right? Doesn't work. And so in your business, you have to prove that trust. What do you think? Do you think people are binging on your show?
Well, according to the listener numbers, probably not, but
So that's a really good point. So I just want to break that down for you and for the listeners out there. So when we see a lot of people join our first couple of episodes, or we have high numbers only on our most recent. So if we see it on our first 3 and our most recent, we see high numbers there that are not translating into a normal average amount in the middle. That means that we have people who are checking out our show, which is good. They're finding us, but it means they're not subscribing and listening all the way through. These are just indicators. And it doesn't matter whether you have 100 listeners or 1,000 listeners or 10,000 listeners. Like, it's still the same indicator. Our first few shows are the way people get a taste of us. And then there are those binge listeners who just come into the most recent because they want current information, right? So they'll check out the most recent one. So you will always see higher numbers on those. But when you see a really nice transfer between the new numbers you see, so let's say your episode 1 this week got 100 new listeners to it, and you got 50 on the episodes that follow, half of the people who tried you came in and then listened to more episodes. That's great, right? You have a 50% transfer into subscribers from listening to that first episode. That would be amazing numbers, and you should be really thrilled with that. Some people have it where it's like 10% or, but just knowing what that is, that's how you're going to see the bingeability, because then you'll see them going one after the other. And the more episodes you have, of course, the more they'll reach out to you and tell you they're binging on you. That's when you really know.
Right. I will say that, the couple things that have happened that I think are encouraging. Number one is I do get people reaching out to me saying, I listen to your show all the time, which is great. And it's very humbling. And I'm like, wow, that's awesome. The other thing I'll say is that the numbers have gone up every month that I've been doing the show.
That's good.
So there is some positives there. I think that sometimes it's just a thing of being tough on yourself about, like, you don't have 1 million followers the first month. It's like, what's wrong with you? But and nobody's
You're not out there playing NFL sports with the access to 1 million people. So give yourself a break.
Right. So, but it's a good question, and it's a fair one too.
Yeah. Well, so here's what I think. So every show has a bingeability characteristic to it, whether you're talking about millions of people binging on you or hundreds of people binging on you, right? What matters is that it's the right people binging. because you have a business to run at the end of the day. So what I suspect is happening for you is that your topics are leading people in and they're finding you, and then they're saying, well, I learned about this. Now I want to know about this, this, and this, and I see episodes, so I'm going to keep listening. So at some point in that process, they will hit the subscribe button. Once they've done a couple of them, they'll go, okay, let's just subscribe because there's going to be new things coming in. I don't want to miss it. So that translates into your bump in subscriber base. But I suspect that they're coming in and jumping around a little bit before they start binging on it. But if someone's saying, like, I might, my kids just got drafted. Like, what do I do? Like, I could see a parent going in and finding your show just from the great keywords and the things that you're talking about, that going in and going, oh, wow. Oh, and I should know about this. And oh, I should listen to that. Right. And so I think from an education standpoint, it's a really educational show if you want to inform yourself about how an industry works and the really critical factors in that industry, what I should know today. So you've done a fabulous job of that. And, you're not a boring lawyer, Jeremy.
Thank you.
There's nothing boring about it. And that doesn't surprise me because we have a friend in common, Brandon Leopoldis, and Brandon doesn't hang around with boring people. So, so that's also helpful, is that you're talking in plain English and you're not making it boring and too legalese for us.
No, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. You've really brought up a great idea in the sense of looking for topics that are helpful to people versus topics that I originally just chose because I thought it was interesting to me. That's a really good point because, you could really help some people, but also increase your listeners.
So before we wrap up here, do you have any advice for someone out who's sitting on the fence out there thinking, yeah, I got a law firm, I got an accounting firm, I've got these kinds of things. I'm a professional, like I don't really need to do this. Do you have advice for them about, the power of, or whether or not what they should consider before starting a podcast?
Really good question. I always answer that question, and because I get questions like that a lot from, let's say, other professionals or law students or college students or somebody who's been in a career for 40 years. And I always answer it by saying the power of anything I've found is in geography, branding, and community. And geography the fact is zip codes still matter. And so if you want to be in entertainment and sports, you probably need to be in Los Angeles. And there's some exceptions to that, but that's generally the rule. Branding is both about who you have connections with in terms of your alumni base, in terms of where you went to school, but it's also about what are you putting out there in terms of content. And that can be through an article, a podcast. So of course it could help you. And then really community is the last piece. I always say that join organizations like you were talking about Fuel earlier, or, Sports Lawyers Association, California Lawyers Association. These types of groups that allow opportunities for people to connect, take on leadership, and meet people. To me, I find that all my business comes from that sort of three-pronged prism. So a podcast fits right inside there.
Wonderful. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I really appreciate it. Bleav in Sports Law, that is available on every directory out there. So go check it out and check out how Jeremy runs his show. Check out how the Bleav Network runs and go check out his Binge Factor for yourself.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Binge Factor podcast. For more information on podcasting and videocasting success tips and tactics, please go to thebingefactor.com. And be sure to listen to our other show for podcasters called Feed Your Brand. If you'd like to be interviewed on this show, as well as featured in Tracy's column, please go to thebingefactor.com/guest and apply.